Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. We are waiting for a few more people to join, and we'll start at the top of the hour shortly. I see we have about 80 people. Let's give a minute, and then we'll get started. Okay, a very warm welcome to everyone joining us today for the first webinar in the IFC-UN Women series on addressing gender data gaps in the private sector. I'm Manjula Nerikumara, Senior Program Officer in the Gender Policy and Regulations Unit of the World Bank Group's Gender Department. We are delighted to have participants from across regions, sectors, and institutions with us. Your engagement underscores just how important and timely this conversation is. Today, we bring together two newly launched flagship reports from IFC and UN Women, both of which spotlight a shared message. Closing gender data gaps is essential to building the economic and business case for women's participation and leadership. Over the next 60 minutes, you'll hear insights from global experts and practitioners across government, the private sector, and standard-setting bodies and academia on how better data can drive real progress. Please feel free to type any questions for our speakers into the chat at any time. We will address them during the Q&A session. You can also click like on any questions you'd especially like our panelists to answer. And please let us know where you are joining from. We would love to hear. Thank you for taking the time to be here, and we look forward to an energizing and solution-focused discussion. We're delighted to co-host this webinar on addressing the gender data gaps together with UN Women and the Women's Empowerment Principles Secretariat. This partnership reflects our shared commitment to strengthening the global gender data ecosystem and driving meaningful progress. I'll begin by sharing a few highlights from our newly launched IFC report, Closing the Gender Gap, a data outlook on women's economic opportunities. After that, I will invite our UN Women colleague, Megan Gilgan, Director of Strategic Partnerships, who will share some key messages from their latest report, Unfinished Business, which also advances the gender data agenda. Our brief presentations will set the stage for the rich panel discussion ahead. For those who want to dive deeper, we'll share a QR code at the end so you can explore the full report. Even with global progress, major gender data gaps remain across the private sector. These gaps limit the ability of businesses, policymakers, and investors to design inclusive strategies and measure real progress. Why does gender data matter? 4 simple reasons. 1, it uncovers inequities in workplaces, in financial access, and across value chains. It enables evidence-driven decisions that leads more inclusive outcomes. It guides companies to act where gaps are most acute, for example, in supply chains, unlocking better performance, stronger profit, and smarter decisions. It fuels innovation and collaboration, helping the private sector move faster and farther on gender equality. Closing gender gaps is essential to unlock women's economic opportunities, drive inclusive growth, and strengthen sustainability private sector development. What does the report deliver? The report offers a clear assessment of the availability, quality, and gaps in gender data, shaping women's economic opportunities in the private sector. It maps 20 data sources across 10 thematic areas, including access to capital, entrepreneurship, digital access, and others, covering 429 gender-relevant indicators. The report identifies critical gaps, inconsistent methodologies, and limited coverage of SMEs, small firms, and informal enterprises. It recommends concrete actions to strengthen the gender data ecosystem, highlighting the need for private sector gender portals for gender data. The key challenges. Across existing data sources, we saw two major challenges: weak data quality and uneven coverage, driven by irregular collection cycles, reliance on self-reported data, and limited inclusion of SMEs and informal firms, and significant comparability issues, including inconsistent definitions and limited sector, firm size, and cross-country alignment. Going from gaps to action, the report serves as a foundational driver for the IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank Group, Private Sector Gender Data Hub, which we are building to address some of the limitations pointed out in the report. They are harmonizing gender indicators and reporting standards, consolidating and integrating data across public and non-public sources, building longitudinal comparable data sets across countries and sectors, providing technical guidance, governance, and alignment of indicator selection and reporting. And finally, and motivating the private sector to collect, disclose, and use gender data to strengthen accountability and inform investment decisions. What is our call to action? To close gender data gaps, we need coordinated action across the ecosystem. This means harmonizing gender indicators, moving toward mandatory and consistent reporting, and ensuring regular and high-quality data collection. It also requires stronger private sector collaboration, smarter use of big data, and strategic partnerships with policymakers and research institutions. Together, these steps will build a more reliable gender data foundation to advance women's economic inclusion. And speaking of partnership and collaboration, we are pleased to welcome our colleagues from UN Women, key partners who are helping drive the global agenda on strengthening gender data. I'm delighted to introduce Megan Gilgan, Director of UN Women's Strategic Partnerships Division. Megan leads the organization's engagement with public and private sector partners to mobilize resources and drive policy and practice changes in support of gender equality. Megan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Manjula, and to all the colleagues from IFC and to our audience today. It's wonderful to be here with a group of like-minded partners who don't just talk about gender equality, but really roll up our sleeves and get to the hard part, often the data. At UN Women, we see every day that gender equality in the private sector remains unfinished business. Many commitments are there, and we can't afford to lose momentum. The economic case is very clear. Closing gender gaps could unlock $342 trillion in economic gains by 2050, while inaction carries a price tag of $160 trillion in lost global wealth. But without reliable, comparable gender data, companies can't benchmark, investors can't reward progress, regulators can't drive accountability, and change remains silent and invisible. That's exactly why our collaboration with IFC is so energizing. Together, we're helping illuminate the data gaps that have held the field back for decades and designing tools that will help close them. It's a partnership rooted in pragmatism, complementary strengths, and a sense of urgency. At UN Women, our engagement with the private sector starts from a simple truth. Gender equality cannot be achieved by governments alone. The private sector shapes how people work, how they earn, innovate, and lead. And when companies shift, societies shift. That's why we are seeking investments in evidence, partnership, and accountability frameworks that help businesses move from good intentions to measurable results. Our unfinished business report is part of that effort. It's our flagship assessment of where the private sector truly stands on gender equality across workplaces, supply chains, leadership, capital flows, and enabling environments. It brings together data from thousands of companies across 117 countries. And its message is clear. We are seeing progress, but not yet at the scale, depth, or speed needed. Globally, women hold just 30% of managerial roles, and at the current rate, achieving parity will take nearly a century. Women make up only 39% of the global workforce and remain concentrated in lower paid roles. The gender pay gap remains stuck around 20%, and women-owned businesses remain largely absent from major supply chains. There is also a gap in the positioning of the private sector as a key stakeholder to advance progress for gender equality. Our team conducted a review of 144 national progress reports on gender equality commitments to the Beijing Platform for Action. Only 42% of states actually reported private sector participation in national equality coordination mechanisms. This indicates a need for improvement in how the private sector is engaged in this issue and in these plans. Commitments are rising, but outcomes remain unclear without data. Much of the progress to date has focused on policies and voluntary commitments, but persistent gender data gaps make it difficult to assess whether pay gaps are closing, whether women are moving into technical or higher paid roles, or whether procurement and supply chains are becoming more gender responsive. Critical areas such as parental leave uptake, return to work rates, violence and harassment prevention, and supplier coverage are inconsistently reported or missing altogether. The evidence is unequivocal. Where companies are systematically held to account, disclosure is stronger and practice is deeper. Board diversity rules, equal pay legislation, due diligence obligations, and transparency mandates correlate with measurable improvements for women. What's more, through data, we are able to prove that gender equality is good for business. Additional findings from UN Women's Inclusion Equals Income research conducted with the Said Business School found that positive gender portrayals in advertising drive a 3.5% immediate sales uplift, a 16% longer-term increase, while boosting customer loyalty by 15%. Influencing corporate policies and business practices can drive both profit, progress, and growth. No single institution can close the gender data deficit alone. Partnerships across UN Women, IFC, the UN system, investors, regulators, and companies are beginning to create shared benchmarks and coherent evidence ecosystems. To name a few, UN Women's own data initiatives such as the WEP's Transparency and Accountability Framework and the IFC's Gender Data Hub all demonstrate that transparent evidence and common indicators accelerate accountability and action. The tools exist, the evidence is clear, and the partnerships are in place. For gender equality in the private sector to be more than aspirational, what we need now is harmonized, gender disaggregated indicators embedded into global reporting and sustainability frameworks. We need collective will across companies, investors, regulators, and governments to adopt these harmonized indicators, disclose meaningful data, and use that data to drive change. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from our panel today as they unpack these issues further and see how we can together accelerate our progress. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan, for the insights from UN Women's perspective, very relevant for this conversation. And now to guide us through what I know will be a rich and insightful discussion, I'm delighted to hand over to my colleague, Michael Sullivan. Michael is the lead economist and head of the World Bank Group's Africa Gender Innovation Lab, where he drives evidence-based work on what truly moves the needle on gender equality. Today, he'll be moderating our panel and engaging our speakers in a conversation that brings data, innovation, and real-world experience together. Michael, over to you to lead us into the discussion.
Thank you, Manjula, and good day all, good evening, wherever you may be. It's a pleasure to moderate this panel discussion today on this critical agenda around addressing gender data gaps. First, allow me to introduce our esteemed panelists for today's discussion, representing perspectives from government, private sector, international organizations, and academia. We're delighted to have Mary Woolridge, CEO of the Workplace Gender Equality Agency for the Government of Australia. She leads the agency in driving gender equality in workplaces, ensuring that all people are fairly represented and equally valued and rewarded. Jessica Espinoza is CEO of 2X Global, the global industry body for gender lens investing, convening the entire spectrum of capital providers. Under Jessica's leadership, the 2X Challenge has raised more than $34 billion of gender lens investments since its launch at the G7 summit in 2018, and has catalyzed action at the nexus of gender and climate finance. Fälth leads the Secretariat of the Women's Empowerment Principles, an initiative of UN Women and the UN Global Compact. Anna provides policy advice, promotes online collaboration, learning, and innovation to advance women's economic empowerment across the world. And Siri Chilazi is a senior researcher at the Women and Public Policy Program at Harvard Kennedy School and is an internationally recognized expert in advancing women and promoting gender equity in organizations. And just as Manjula mentioned, I just want to reiterate that we ask that you please add your questions in the chat throughout this panel discussion and use the like button to upvote the questions that you're most curious about. And we'll address the sort of top questions during the Q&A session after the panel. So let's get started. Perhaps we'll start with you, Anna. In 2025, over 800 companies across 118 countries reported their gender equality progress through the Women's Empowerment Principles, a powerful sign of collective momentum. Could you share more on what the evidence from the WGEA survey shows about where businesses and the private sector currently stand on the gender data indicators, and how does tracking benefit these businesses?
Thank you so much, Michael. It's a great question. The evidence from this survey of last year is quite revealing. As you said, more than 800 companies across 180 countries shared how they are advancing gender equality through the Women's Empowerment Principles, or in short, WEPs. That alone tells us something important. Companies want to engage on gender data. It's no longer fringe or voluntary issues. But the survey also showed us what companies really are on gender data tracking. So let me give you two top-line insights to these findings. The first one is that most companies are still at the starting line, or just beyond it, if I may suggest that. They are tracking what I would call foundational indicators, like workforce composition by gender, basic parity matrix, or whether policies exist or not. These are very, very important, don't get me wrong, but they mainly tell us who is in the room, not what is actually changing. So when the data drops off is when we move towards outcomes and accountability. For example, are women progressing at the same rate as men? Are pay gaps closing over time? Are leaders held accountable for results? And what's happening beyond the workplace, as we heard earlier, in the marketplace and supply chains, very important. Those indicators are far less consistently tracked. So the second insight is that capacity really matters. The survey showed huge variation by region, sector, and company size, even for very, very basic indicators. And many companies told us honestly, we want to do more, but we don't know where to start, where the indicators matter most, and how to scale this over time. So as you heard from Megan just now, we are currently working on a WEPS transparency and accountability roadmap designed to address these challenges and gaps. So instead of saying report everything everywhere all at once, the roadmap offers a phased maturity-based pathway from beginners to improvers, achievers, and leaders. It aims to help companies prioritize, build systems over time, and move from counting people to managing impact. Now, on the business value, because that's where the data really becomes interesting, is that gender data is not just about disclosure. It is a management tool. Companies that track gender data can see where talent is leaking, where bias shows up in the promotion and pay decisions, and where risks are hiding, especially in supply chains, where gender risks are often invisible until something goes wrong. The survey also reinforced that what we hear again and again from investors and boards, good gender data is a signal of good governance. It supports risk management, resilience, long-term performance, and it strengthens credibility with investors, help attract and retain talent, and build trust with consumers and partners. So bottom line, the evidence tells us that companies are engaging, but most are still early in the data journey. The opportunity now is to move from intention to systems, from reporting to decision-making, and from isolated metrics to accountability. And that's where this combination of the insights from this WEPS survey and the transparency and accountability roadmap really matters, because together they show us that it's not just where companies are, but how they can move forward at a pace according to their capacity. So thanks, and back to you, Michael.
Thank you so much, Anna, and it's a great transition to our conversation with Mary, moving from intention to systems and helping sort of build out that data ecosystem. So Mary, Australia's recent track record around gender equality is striking. Record low gender pay gap of 11.5%. Women's workforce participation is up to 63.5%. And we're seeing public disclosure of company gender data really down to the individual firm. So could you tell us about the ecosystem enablers that the Workplace Gender Equality Agency has set up to enable these data-driven changes in the private sector? And does the government of Australia, for example, use these data to inform their public procurement in favor of companies which are committed to equality?
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Michael, and wonderful to be with everyone on the call. We have a very fortunate context that the legislation that enables or establishes the Workplace Gender Equality Agency actually articulates the business case, because our mandate is to promote and improve gender equality in workplaces, to remove barriers to women's full and equal participation, and importantly, to enhance business productivity through advancing gender equality. That's the context and the agreement and the starting point to then enable us, which is what we do, is we then collect from every medium and large employer in Australia. They report to us detailed gender equality data annually, and that's about 8,000 companies that we collect that information from. And what we do with that data, and it's quite a comprehensive data set, is we publish it comprehensively and make it freely available to everyone. We do progress tracking and benchmarking at an employer, industry, and national level. And we take the insights that come out of it on what works to accelerate change. So it is an incredibly rich data source. And what we find is that that motivates action on a whole range of fronts. Internally, the reports that we provide back to employers are required on their own performance, but also how they benchmark against their peers, are required to be provided to their boards. With the evidence is shown in the research evaluation that we've done has led to a desire for enhanced literacy policy in relation to the most senior business leaders about gender equality and its impact, and what they need to do for change. It is a catalyst for action, and it mobilises them to create the authorising environment for change in the workplaces that they're overseeing. The results are also shared very directly with employees and with unions, and that informs discussion and consultation. But there's a lot of external mobilisation as a result of having this information that we see. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence of prospective employees actually using the data and engaging in discussions through the recruitment processes about gender pay gap levels and what's driving them and what they're doing about it in terms of addressing those larger gaps. Investors are using it to inform questions, discussions with CEOs, and voting intentions in terms of things like board appointments and remuneration reports at AGMs. The media are using it not only when it's released, but in an ongoing way. When a company is being discussed in the media, they'll often go and say, and this is their gender pay gap, or this is their composition, and use the data that's available, informing them on that front. Employer and advocacy groups use it to inform them, and importantly, the government uses it for policy decision making. So there's a very comprehensive utilisation of the availability of data that then mobilises action. And I think the last leg of that is then, how are employers equipped to then take action that all this transparency and accountability is then driving. And that's been a critical element of then what they say is often they've got the authorising environment, they've got confidence to do it, but they may not have the time, resources or knowledge about how to translate that into action. And so that's why I think having a legislated mandated requirement gets over that time limitation, because it's a requirement to do. There are consequences of not doing it, but then offering support in terms of how you analyse the insights you take from the data and use that to develop your action plan, set your targets, and ultimately drive change. So, it's no doubt that data is valued, the data is used, the data is expected, that it is now built into what people expect in terms of, their understanding and insights into employers. And interestingly, we have a 95% compliance rate with reporting. So it is being brought into by the employers themselves because of the nature of that context.
Great, thanks very much. And now we'll turn to you, Jessica. The 2X criteria has really become a global benchmark for gender smart investing. So it's shaping how capital flows towards women's leadership, jobs, economic participation. So looking back at the development of these 2X criteria, what was the most challenging trade-off or breakthrough moment in designing a gender framework that provided capital providers and private sector companies graded benchmarks by industry and country?
Thank you so much, Michael, and hello, everybody. It's great to be part of this conversation. So the fundamental trade-off that we faced when we developed the 2X criteria for gender finance was the trade-off between ambition versus adoption. So when we developed the criteria, there were some existing indicators already out there. They focused primarily on women's ownership, but there was very little that captured women's economic participation across the full value chain. And so from the start, our ambition was broader than only focusing on who owns the company, but also to consider who leads it, who is employed, who benefits from its products and services, and how investors and capital providers can really pay attention to those opportunities along their own investment cycle or financial decision-making cycle. So for lenders as well, kind of how they think about lending opportunities. And so that meant designing a framework that worked across asset classes, across geographies, and even kind of thinking about capital providers in sectors like infrastructure or working with large corporates where perhaps they see less of a angle to support women entrepreneurs to say, no, but you can still do something meaningful because women are also important actors across the whole business value chain. So that was really important for us to make it accessible. And so the challenge was, where do you set the bar so that it is meaningful without making it inaccessible and kind of more applicable only to certain types of investments or certain types of sectors or geographies, for instance. And so we made 3 deliberate design choices. The first one was to really anchor it in the business case. So very intentionally, the criteria were grounded in commercial relevance so that it would resonate with a full spectrum of capital providers. Then we developed clear thresholds that were simple enough to scale. So we kept ownership at international standards that already at the time were equal or greater 51% women's ownership. But then we also really looked at leadership, at employment, and products and services. And in particular for leadership and employment, we used industry-specific benchmarks that look at, in a certain market, what's the nexus between industry and country, and where is the status quo currently, and then how can we make it a bit more ambitious than what the average currently is. The other third factor was to think about early harmonization with other global standards. And so from the outset, we aligned the 2X criteria with IRIS Plus and HIPSO as already widely adopted standards at the time. And we also collaborated with UN Women to identify synergies with the WEPs and with OECD to align with the DAC gender marker. From there on, we heard consistent feedback that 2X and the criteria are a great entry point, but how do we kind of go further from there? And so here again, we had this trade-off where, like, okay, we could either dramatically increase the thresholds or the criteria, but then are we losing other actors who are just coming along, who are perhaps a bit more in the private sector, more in the commercial side? And so how do we kind of keep the simplicity and the accessibility, but also raising the ambition over time? And instead of significantly changing the 2X criteria, we decided to gradually raise the bar on the 2X criteria, but then also to introduce a 2X certification mechanism that now takes it further for those who are ready to go further. And so 2X certification distinguishes between good, advanced, and best in class, and also a much more comprehensive assessment framework across different gender dimensions and themes. And that way, it has allowed us to keep the 2X criteria simple enough to make them accessible and scalable as an on-ramp, while providing certification for those who are ready to go further. And so in short, how we dealt with that trade-off was to recognize that scaling gender data required meeting institutions where they are, while also giving them a clear path to go further when they are ready to go further.
Thank you so much, Jessica. So Siri, let's turn to you and the kind of frontier research that you're conducting around closing gender gaps by redesigning organizational processes, including, collaborating with startups, multinationals, and governments. So you talk about data disclosure as a behavioral tool, one that the private sector can use to shift norms, make workplaces more inclusive, and change hiring, promotion, training. Can you tell us about what you're learning from this research?
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be here with you and everyone. So you're absolutely right. Research from decades now shows that collecting data and disclosing it can be a very powerful tool for behavior change, whether that's in a single organization in the private sector or otherwise, or even in a whole country in the world. But research also points to a critical ingredient that has to be present alongside collecting and disclosing data, and that's accountability. And Mary mentioned this. The US tech sector is an excellent example. Beginning in 2014, large tech companies like Google and Meta and Microsoft and others started to release workforce composition reports that were broken down by gender and race, among other things. But everybody's numbers were horrible. And so no single company felt particularly bad about how they were doing in comparison to their peers. And fast forward to today, more than a decade later, those numbers, women's representation across the workforce, in leadership, in technical roles, has barely budged. So collecting and disclosing data really becomes a powerful engine for change when there's an element of accountability attached to it. That accountability can come from you as the discloser caring about what the data says, right? Maybe because you care about your reputation in the marketplace, your reputation among prospective employees, job seekers, or such. Or it can come because someone outside of you cares about what the data says. Consumer disclosures are a great example of this when you're going to buy a car or refrigerator, and there's a report card that grades that car or refrigerator on a scale of A to F, let's say, on how much energy it's going to use. You as a consumer care very much about how much money it's going to cost you over 10 years to own that car or that refrigerator. And so the grade actually drives your purchasing decisions. So as we think about, I saw a couple of questions in the chat about how might governments and regulators design disclosure requirements in a way that they're effective and powerful, but that they don't impose a really onerous reporting requirement, because we're seeing some pushback in the EU, for example, to these disclosure requirements that are perceived as excessively demanding, is we have to really prioritize and be laser focused on what are the most essential metrics that both the disclosers will care about and the world outside them, the people who can hold them accountable from the inside and outside, will care about, so that the act of disclosure actually translates into accountability, which then will drive action. And that's the second thing that research shows, is it shows accountability is critical, but also that disclosure in itself isn't enough. It has to translate into action. And I want to go back to something Mary was starting to talk about with the Australian experience, which is really world leading as far as I've seen, which is, yes, companies are required to report their pay gaps, but they're also now required to report to the Australian government an action plan that shows what concrete steps they're going to do to close those gaps going forward. And that's a very nice concrete way that a government or a regulator can build in that step of translating disclosure into action. And then the next year and the year after that, to actually make sure that those action plans have been followed and that the results are showing progress and the needle moving in the right direction.
Thank you so much, Siri. This is great. So we have a few more minutes for another round of questions before we open it up for Q&A from you all. So perhaps we'll come back to you, Anna. You know, the women's empowerment principles data tell a story of rising ambition across 50 industries, and it's not just multinationals showing up. You know, 60% of respondents are SMEs and nearly half are women-led. So what insights have you gleaned from working with SMEs and women-led businesses, and what is their rate of disclosure relative to larger private sector firms? And if I could add another question, how can these entities be enabled to accelerate progress?
Great, thank you, Michael. And I really welcome this question, because engaging with SMEs and women-led businesses has been one of the most useful parts in building out what I talked about a bit earlier, the WEP's Transparency and Accountability Roadmap. One of the strongest signals that we got from the survey last year is exactly what you highlighted, that this agenda is no longer driven only by large multinationals. 60% of the respondents were from SMEs, and nearly half were women-led businesses. So that tells us that gender equality is being taken up as a business priority, not just a compliance exercise for those that is required either by law or through listed criteria. So what have we learned? First, ambition is high, often higher than the capacity. So many SMEs and women-led businesses are deeply values-driven. Many embed gender equality directly into the leadership culture, workplace policies, and day-to-day decision-making. In fact, in areas like inclusive leadership, flexibility, and workplace culture, they often move faster than larger firms because they can. They're often more flexible and nimble to do so. However, the data where the gap appears in formal disclosure is compared to larger companies. SME tend to disclose less data, less frequently, and less publicly. Not because they care less and not because they don't want to do it, but because they face real constraints. And that's where our survey told us. They have limited staff, limited data systems, overlapping reporting demands, and feel designed for large and listed companies. And second, SMEs tells us very clearly complexity is the largest barrier. And we heard that also earlier in the about the IFC report. They struggle with long indicator lists, technical language, and frameworks that assume dedicated sustainability teams. As a result, reporting can feel overwhelming, duplicative, or disconnected from business reality. And that's what we have learned, that one size fits all disclosure does not work. So how can we then enable SMEs and women-led businesses to accelerate progress? The first, I would say, is prioritization. SMEs need clarity on what matters the most at different stages of maturity. And again, our roadmap will help flesh that out a little bit, starting with the core, decision useful indicators, and allowing companies to build depth over time. Second, capacity building beats compliance. SMEs respond better to practical tools like templates, examples, peer learning, and short focus guidance, not lengthy reporting manuals. So when reporting is framed in a way that to improve business decisions, not just satisfy external demands, engagement increases dramatically. And third, interoperability matters. So SMEs are especially exposed to reporting fragmentation. Aligning gender indicators across frameworks and jurisdictions reduce burden and makes disclosure achievable, particularly for SMEs. So we have some work to do here. And finally, recognition matters. For many women-led and smaller businesses, being visible, being counted is itself an incentive. And we provide a platform connecting SMEs to global norms while respecting their scale and context. So I would say a takeaway from this is that SMEs and women-led businesses are not lagging in ambition. They're often leading in intent. But our job is to meet them where they are, simplify the journey, and ensure that transparency and accountability becomes tools for growth, resilience, and credibility, not barriers for participation. So thank you so much, Michael,
Thank you, Anna.
Back to you.
Thanks very much. So Mary, we have about 3 minutes for response. If you could, we'd like to learn from, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency model as a best practice. As we mentioned already, Australia has really made strong progress on this front in the workplace, but what is the next big step the government plans to take to make sure that these gains continue? And how will you make sure that companies don't just sort of follow the rules on paper, but actually create real change? The point that we heard from Siri earlier in terms of moving from a disclosure to action.
Yeah. And it's a great question. And what we've seen over 12 years of reporting and the transparency and accountability of the data is that the progress was slowing. So there's a new requirement this year for the first time that actually large companies are required to improve their outcomes. And it's actually using the data that has been already reported to WGEA. So we've got a context and accountability which sets a baseline, and the companies need to select 3 targets on gender equality from the data that's reported to us. We know they're evidence-based data in terms of what drives change in workplaces, and they have to tell us what those targets are. We will publish those targets, and they have 3 years to meet or demonstrate improvement against those targets. So it's all about shifting in relation to their performance. And some of that might be policy-based. If they don't have a paid parental leave policy, putting it in place, for example. But at least one of them must be numeric, and that might be a narrowing of the gender pay gap, improving composition of board, management, executive roles. It might be the uptake of parental leave, paid parental leave by men. So a numeric accountability about outcome delivery and performance. And we have seen very positive responses already in terms of the preparation for this happening. Once again, the engagement of boards. We're getting a lot of feedback from HR teams that doors that haven't been open to C-suite and boards are now opening. They're engaging in these conversations. It's mobilising behaviour because, once again, it's a requirement under the Act, and that compliance and mandatory aspect is driving the performance difference. And what's been interesting here is, while there was resistance when we were established, we actually had support of the key business groups for the introduction of targets as a mechanism to accelerate change on gender equality. So it is the translation of going from having the data and reporting to the data to actually now having an expectation of delivering improvement that can be measured, monitored, and that the organisations are held accountable for.
Great, thank you, Mary. So Jessica, having the backing of the G7 governments has been instrumental in the adoption of the 2X criteria by capital providers. Could you share with us some more about how to keep the momentum going and using gender data to mobilize private capital to support gender equality and women's economic empowerment?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and also an important reminder how the 2X criteria actually became widely adopted as an industry standard across global markets. And it started with the 2X challenge that was launched at the G7 summit in 2018. And it was really launched as a collective capital commitment, but has also been widely celebrated as one of the most effective public-private partnerships, because the DFIs and MDBs, so the development finance institutions and multilateral development banks, took the early lead and really demonstrated with this initiative that there is a strong business case and that there is a strong investment pipeline. And based on that, that created confidence for the private sector, both investment firms as well as financial institutions, to follow and really be part of that initiative. And so under that initiative, since it was started, we have collectively invested over $35 billion now, using the 2X criteria framework as our shared framework, and have seen that even beyond that initiative, many other actors have adopted the 2X criteria. And so fast forward in today's environment, I think sometimes because this has been so successful, it might seem like the public side of this partnership is less important now. But I would argue that in today's environment is actually more important than ever that we keep this public-private leadership. And we consistently see that the private sector institutions, they really want to engage, but they still rely heavily on the DFIs and MDBs to, first of all, set credible benchmarks and set expectations and show what good looks like, but then also to really lead the way and to bring the private sector along. And gender data plays a crucial role in that context because it reduces uncertainty. It also makes the business case really visible and quantifiable. And it helps capital to kind of move from intention, which I think there's a lot of, to actual allocation and action. And so from my perspective, there are three things that really matter right now. The first one is renewed public leadership, so that the DFIs and MDBs continue to lead by example in setting targets, in deploying capital, and in disclosure, and really working with their clients in the private sector towards that. The second point is private sector integration rather than add-ons. So gender data must sit inside investment and credit committees, inside business strategy, risk frameworks, and product design, so that it's not a side metric, but is really a core input to make gender a value driver along the business value chain. And then the third factor is clear pathways for ambition. So again, from the 2X perspective, using the 2X criteria as the entry point, and then using deeper tools like 2X certification to ensure that the field keeps expanding and deepening. And I would say linked to that also for all of us in this room who have different frameworks that have worked really well in practice, to see how we can collaborate and really make it clear for different types of organizations to understand which tool is most helpful in which context.
Thank you, Jessica. So Siri, just like my team at the Africa Gender Innovation Lab, you've taken your research into the field, running randomized control trials to really test what actually works. So drawing on this RCT evidence from a range of organizations, what are some practical interventions that have proven most effective in reducing bias and improving women's hiring, retention, and growth outcomes in the workplace?
There's a common theme that emerges from this body of research that's more than half a century old already. And that common theme is that advancing gender equality, closing gender gaps, reducing bias, it can't be a program, but it has to be a way that we do all the things that we're already doing, right? So instead of starting a special hiring program to get more women in the door, or a special leadership training program that targets women, or giving parental leave, maternity leave to women only. If instead we debias our hiring process for everyone so that we can put everyone through the same hiring process, we actually see better outcomes. If we revisit our promotion processes, our performance evaluation criteria, and make sure that they are fair across the board, then we might not need special programs for women because we're actually giving everybody equal opportunity to advance. Research also shows that paradoxically, maybe one of the most effective ways to promote gender equality at work is actually to incentivize men to take on a bigger role in the home. So to provide equal parental leave to everybody, and then to make an extra effort to encourage men to take it, because socially still it's more acceptable for women to take maternity leave. And so we see in the data that women will take whatever leave they're offered. Men often don't. So they need a little extra nudge. So what you're seeing is that the examples I'm providing, they actually attack these systems of how we work, our ways of operating, our ways of doing work, rather than being separate add-ons that are a line item that's very easy to cut when budget gets tight or when political winds shift or a new leader comes in with different priorities. Because certain things like hiring, promoting, paying people, those are happening every day of every year in every single organization, no matter the macroeconomic climate, no matter the leadership, no matter the political winds. So it's those everyday foundations of work that we need to tweak and improve, often in very small and low-cost ways, to actually achieve more gender equality. Let me give you just one example. This actually comes from a large public sector employer in Australia. They saw a gender gap in the number of women and men that were applying to leadership roles after they had been rejected. So folks had applied to one position, not gotten it. And after that, men were twice as likely to reapply to a new leadership opening. And this organization was already sending an email to all applicants saying, thanks for applying. We're sorry you didn't get the job this time, but many similar open positions exist. Please reapply. And they ran an experiment where they simply added one line to that email that said, you were in the top 20% of applicants. Please reapply. And that addition of one sentence that cost them nothing closed the gender gap in reapplications because it provided more transparency to candidates about where they stood. It made people realize that, wow, if I'm in the top 20%, I actually have a realistic chance of getting selected the next time. So it's probably worth my time and effort to invest in a new application. And it reduced ambiguity around the process. So those are the types of simple structural interventions that research has been shown to make the biggest positive difference.
Thanks so much, Siri. It's exciting to hear all of the frontier evidence that you're really generating on your side. I think now we'll sort of open it up for some Q&A. We've received some great questions already in the chat that we'll address. I will sort of try to direct these questions. I'm just trying to think about some quick themes that are emerging, around the discussions around kind of moving from counting to changing, and really kind of moving from not just who's in the room, but whether there are gaps that are actually closing. We're hearing a lot of discussion around accountability and how that can really be an engine for change in using data, and the importance of kind of designing effective frameworks that balance this ambition with accessibility, the trade-off between rigorous standards but not wanting to set the bar too high so that companies won't engage. So maybe we'll sort of pose a few questions with the remaining time we have. First to you, maybe Mary and Anna, want to hear kind of How can governments and regulators incentivize stronger gender data disclosure while avoiding these kind of excessive reporting burdens, especially for SMEs and smaller firms? What approaches do you think strike that right balance between accountability and feasibility?
I might kick off because we do think about this a lot, and we have a threshold of 100 or more employees for reporting to us for exactly that reason and the burden. And what's interesting is some of our further requirements are 500 or more employees. So the economies and the benefits you get, while we do want everyone to be working on it, we have 75% or 25% of the companies that report to us have 500 or more employees, but they actually represent 75% of the employees that are covered by reporting to WGEA. So your benefits, are really concentrated often in the larger employers. And when we think about, should reporting happen down to 50 employees, we would actually double the number of companies that report to us, but only increase our employee coverage by about 5%. So there is this real trade-off of what do you get by the mandatory requirements, and does some of that benefit flow to smaller companies because of the frameworks, because of the environment that's created with the discussion, the expectations from employees, by the benefit of others reporting, and they're adjacent to it. And we do believe there's some benefit that flows from that, and are comfortable and are not looking to sort of make those shifts, despite some international reports recommending thresholds for lower reporting.
Great, thanks. Anna, did you want to also comment on this question?
Yeah, I had a very similar point, actually, kind of distinguishing between different sizes of companies, but also giving them a time frame. What we've seen, for example, now in the EU with the CSDDD, that is starting to require more due diligence of companies in the supply chain, that it can help kind of have some accountable, that larger companies, but then giving others a little bit more time to comply. And it does take time, but I think those kind of directives and national legislation is also helping companies to give them some time to actually set up a team that they can have to look into these issues, and not either to be penalizing those that are laggers, but kind of complemented, as I was saying earlier, with capacity building, with tools, with resources to kind of help them along. Because this is not easy to kind of, it's not the bread and butter of these companies to measure certain indicators. So they need extra support and tools to kind of help them on the way. But I think we are also working to foster this accountability through supply chains. And this is also where the buyers of certain goods and products, goods and services can really kind of help foster that kind of engagement on these discussions as well. But otherwise, I fully agree with Mary on what she was just saying. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And Siri, we have just a couple minutes left. Maybe if you've touched on this in your remarks around what we've been learning, but there is this question around, what are some of the tangible steps that private sector firms can take to make the pipeline of hiring more equitable? And how else can the private sector be enabled to increase disclosure, but also take those actions, take those tangible steps?
So data is an invaluable tool in laser pinpointing where the issues are so that you can then go and solve them in a targeted way. So in terms of the pipeline, right, compare the pool of applicants that applies to your jobs to the pool of available talent in your region. If you're looking to fill a computer, software engineering role, and 20% of the graduates from computer science degree programs in your area are women, if only 10% of the applicants to your job are women, you've got a gap there, right? Your applicants are not representative of the pool. That might be an indication that you have to go advertise your jobs more widely or create connections in the community that allow you to attract a more diverse pool from the very top of the funnel. And then you can look at the data for every single stage of your hiring process, your resume review, reviews, your interviews, whatever different steps you have, and make sure that you're not losing women disproportionately in any stage of the process. If you are, that might be a red flag to go examine that stage of the process, let's say a resume review, more closely, and make sure that there's not unconscious bias creeping in to how you're assessing candidates at that stage. So data really is the ultimate diagnostic tool that then helps us spend our very limited time, right, and limited effort, bandwidth, money on solving those problems that are the most urgent.
Great, thank you. Perhaps a question for whoever wishes to field it. There's a question around norms. You know, and the question is basically in Asia Pacific, especially SMEs in Malaysia, gender data reporting is still a challenge due to socio-cultural norms. Is there a specific type of capacity building that private sector would benefit from, accounting for these social norms? So, you know, maybe not, if we don't need to answer this specific question, but if you want to talk in more broad terms about this, if anyone on our panel would like to weigh in on this question, please do come in.
I might just mention very briefly at UN Women, we have in Asia Pacific specifically gender action labs that really go into resolving issues that companies have. They are targeted for our web signatories. So for those that are not web signatory, it might be an opportunity to become one and also to join up on those efforts that we have in Asia Pacific. So thank you so much for that question.
And maybe if we can have just one last question, perhaps for Jessica, could you perhaps share more on how funds and financial institutions could be incentivized to share more gender data on their investments? I mean, does this differ from MFIs in your experience, for example?
Yeah, so we actually see quite a lot of willingness from both commercial financial institutions, not necessarily the big global ones, but the ones that do receive typical financing from development finance institutions and multilateral development banks. So commercial financial institutions in local markets, especially in emerging markets, who are very willing to share data and disclose, as well as, interestingly, private equity funds and venture capital funds. What does depend is the kind of data that we ask them to disclose. So they're typically very happy to disclose it to their investors or partners where it's kind of in a more contained way. If it's truly public, there are some concerns about commercial aspects. So for instance, private equity funds are more sensitive when it comes to publishing investment amounts because they are concerned that you could derive the valuation. But those are typically data points that are actually more about the transaction rather than the impact side or how they are reaching women. Where we have seen much more openness is disclosing data on how they meet, for example, the 2X criteria or meet the different aspects of 2X certification. So I think here what really matters is to listen to them, understand any commercial competitive concerns, and find a focus kind of on the gender data points that they are typically willing to disclose, at least in our experience. And so in terms of incentives, I think it is tying it to, for example, to funding, of course, or investment, kind of making that part of the investment terms. But I think also setting other incentives like being part of a global initiative where you get recognition. We see, for instance, that certification is a great recognition that financial institutions and funds are interested in because it allows them to position themselves in a global market as a front runner. And our certification does come with minimum disclosure, so there is that public aspect. But it could also be, for instance, kind of giving them other types of rewards where they can either demonstrate the business case of it and thereby attract more, either more investment or other kind of business that's relevant for them in their sector. Or it could be, kind of to give them recognition as a leader and position them in that way.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I really want to thank the presenters and, of course, the panelists for this rich discussion and for all of the questions that came in from the chat. I want to especially acknowledge Mary, who's, I think it's very, very late in Australia, early in the morning. So really, thanks for making that extra effort to participate. I'll hand it over now to you, to Manjula, to close us out.
Very quickly, thank you so much, everyone. This webinar made one message clear. Closing gender data gaps is not just a technical exercise. It is a foundation for accelerating women's economic opportunities and unlocking significant economic and business value. A warm thank you to our panelists, Mary, Jessica, Anna, Siri, and Megan, for their insights, leadership, and commitment. And thank you so much, Mike, for your moderation. It did an excellent job. And thank you all for your engagement and your dedication to advancing this agenda. We look forward to continuing this work together. Great day.